Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Hi there, listener, and welcome to episode 241 of the Ski Podcast. This episode is the latest in a series of podcasts I'm publishing this winter, focusing on women in the snow sports industry. First was BBC Ski Sunday presenter Shemi Alcott, and Shemi has been followed by GB Snow Sports CEO Vicky Gosling, former Ernlow MD Joanna Yelleys-Bound, and Team GB skier Zoe Atkin. You can find links to all those interviews in the show notes for this episode. Now, today, I'm delighted to bring you my conversation with adventurer Elise Wortley. In the last 7 years, Elise has taken on some hugely challenging projects to highlight some of the original and largely forgotten female mountaineers and explorers. What makes her Woman with Altitude project unique is that she has climbed and trekked in places such as the Himalayas, the Alps and the Cairngorms, using the same equipment and clothing that was available to her female predecessors at the time. So we discuss what it's like trying to summit Mont Blanc in hobnail boots, how you source a wooden frame backpack, and the challenges of hiking in woollen knickerbockers. Elise also featured in the Channel 4 programme Alone, where she spent over a month in the Canadian wilderness, well, completely alone. I found talking to Elise so interesting, and I'm sure you'll find her story both fascinating and inspiring too. But before we start, I'd like to thank Intersport Ski Hire for sponsoring the show and making all these episodes possible. If you are heading to the snow, listener, don't forget you can save money when you book your ski hire at intersportrent.com and use the code SKIPODCAST. You'll get a guaranteed discount for ski hire in France, Austria, Switzerland, and to make it even simpler, you don't even need to use a code. Just take the link in the show notes and your basket will automatically be reduced. Right, let's listen to my interview with Elise Wortley, Woman with Altitude. I'm delighted to be joined today by Elise Wortley. Hi Elise, how are you?
I'm good, thank you for having me. Good to be here.
No problem. Whereabouts are you today?
I'm in Brixton, South London. Yeah.
Now, we're not specifically talking about skiing today, although we're talking about mountains. But a question I do always like to ask my guests is, when did you last ski or snowboard? When was that for you, Elise?
Mine was in December, actually. I went on a trip with Inghams to St Anton on the train to celebrate our 90th anniversary. So that was amazing. Yeah.
Actually, I saw some coverage of that because Inghams are celebrating their 90th anniversary this winter. It was Walter Ingham who set up the company, wasn't it? And one of his first trips in those days were all by train. In fact, my parents went with Inghams back in the 60s and everybody went by train back then. But I did read about that and it looked like a fantastic trip. And did you have a good time? How did you find the train experience?
It was great, yeah. It went really quickly, actually, the journey. We were with sort of Shemi Alcott, and yeah, I definitely was trying to play catch up with them all on my skis, but I managed it, so it was fine in the end.
Cool. Well, the reason I wanted to have you on today wasn't specifically to talk about skiing, because we've just passed International Women's Day. And I think when people listen to this podcast, they're going to understand possibly why you're the right guest for this timing. Some people will probably have come across your name. They may have seen your website, which is titled Women with Altitude. I wondered if you could explain what that means, what the project that you're trying to deliver is, and why you set it up.
Yeah, so I actually set it up about 7 years ago now. Gosh, been going for ages. And it all kind of started when I read this book by a woman adventurer when I was 16. So she was called Alexandra David-Neel and she did all these amazing things. She traveled for 14 years in 1910, just left her life behind in Europe. Off she went. She was the first Western woman to meet the Dalai Lama. She lived in a cave for 2 years in the mountains, learning how to do Tummo breathing. And her aim was just to get into Lhasa and to learn more about Buddhism, because obviously back then there wasn't Google or the internet, so they had to go and find these things for themselves. And I remember just reading it and thinking, oh my gosh, like how amazing this woman did that, and why haven't I heard about her? Like, why wasn't I taught about her at school? And that's kind of how it all started, and since then it's really grown, and now I sort of research all these adventurous women like her.
We'll come on to what some of the projects have been, but so Alexandra David-Neel, the book was called My Journey to Lhasa. I think it was published in 1942.
Yeah.
that you come across a book like that? Because I'm guessing they probably don't sell it in Waterstones.
No, I think I just read about it in an art magazine, weirdly. I did an art degree, so I was really interested in sort of painting, and then there was just this thing in this magazine. It was like, this is a book that's really inspired me. So I went and I bought it. And yeah, I too obviously got really inspired by this story, kind of like the hardships she faced and all that sort of thing. So yeah, that's kind of how I found it.
And that journey for her took 14 years, is that right?
Yeah, she just went off for 14 years. Amazing.
And we're talking about that's in the 1920s.
Yeah, she left in 1910. So by the end of 1924, I think she reached Lhasa and got in. And yeah, that was kind of the end of the journey.
So that's a pretty inspiring story. Now, a lot of people would read that book and think, wow, that was amazing. And then they move on and get their next book and read about something else. But, your response to that was slightly different.
Yeah, I mean, her story just always stayed in my head. I don't know, I just was reading things about her on freezing mountain passes, like all the things she did, the illnesses she got, and what she had to battle. And I just always had it in my head that I wanted to follow in her footsteps for some reason. I think it's because everyone I spoke to had never heard of her. So I was always thinking of ways I could maybe sort of highlight her story. And it wasn't till years and years later, when I was 27, I finally felt ready to kind of go off and follow in her footsteps. So I did. Yeah, it's all just sort of grown since then.
And what did following in her footsteps mean in that you didn't spend evidently 14 years
No.
making the journey to Lhasa? And I think getting into Lhasa, it was difficult back then in the 1920s, but also complicated now as well.
Yeah, complicated now as well. And yeah, I decided I didn't want to go for 14 years. So I tried to do the end bit of her journey and go into Lhasa through the mountains. But yeah, it wasn't possible because of all the restrictions that are there. So you're very controlled as a tourist there. So I decided I'd start at the very beginning of her journey. So we went to India, we went to Sikkim, this beautiful like mountainous state, like just Himalaya basically. And we went up to the base camp of Mount Kanchenjunga, which is one of the first places she visited. And yeah, she got her first views of Tibet from up there and just became obsessed with it. So yeah, we went off on this month-long trip, sort of following in her footsteps, and to kind of understand more about what it would have really been like for her, I decided I'd do it in what she had at the time.
Well, I think this is a feature, as we'll discover, of all of the different expeditions that you've done. But what did that mean in reality then, in terms of what equipment you'd be taking or what you'd be wearing?
Yeah, so I had to read through all her books and like find out what women would have had in 1910, because obviously they never talk about what underwear they had or anything like that. So there's a lot of research, like what did women wear in 1910? And then also, because she picked up a lot of stuff on her journey, just kind of working out what clothing she would have had. So she had a big yak wool coat that she kind of used as a blanket as well and slept under. She had these traditional kind of Himalayan boots that she picked up on the way, and then just cotton like undergarments, cotton shirts, and lots of itchy wool she had as well. So it was just piecing together, and then a wooden backpack to carry all her stuff in.
Wooden frame backpack.
Yeah, wooden frame, and then they either put a basket on it or just a canvas bag. So this was the first trip, and it was all a bit haphazard, and I didn't realize how much it cost to buy a vintage backpack from that time. They were kind of like £3,000 or £4,000. So I actually just made it myself out of an old chair, this one, because it was kind of a similar looking frame. So yeah, you can imagine it wasn't the most comfortable.
So that was an amazing adventure. But yeah, your motivation there, and if people have it, I'll put a link in the show notes to your blog, Women with Altitude. But what you're trying to do, I mean, you said, "Oh, you can't believe you weren't educated about her at school, etc." And there's a sense that there's a lot of female explorers who don't crop up in the history books. We've heard of Whymper, and we've heard of Packard and de Saussure, and a lot of the males who did first ascents in different mountains, but we haven't necessarily heard about the female explorers.
Yeah, exactly, because they were always missed out. And actually, a lot of them, so this is a good example, we'll get on to Dorothy Pilley. It's a trip I recently did, but when she was climbing in the early 1900s, when a woman did a climbing route, the men would go, oh, that's obviously very easy. We're going to write it off as an easy route, and we're not going to write about it, or we're not going to even try it. And that was what women were facing. So often their achievements would just get overlooked. I found lots of examples where monks tried to sort of write women out of history who were causing like problems and things like that for them. So they've always always struggled. And then when they did do things, they would never get the same press coverage as the men. And then often if they did, it was kind of degrading writing and made it look like it was an accident and things like that. And they'd never really get the book deals. So that's why a lot of them are missing. And they all did write about their trips in beautiful ways, but they never got the books published, things like that. So then their stories have sort of gone missing and unheard. And it's been really interesting to kind of dig them all out again and try and, share them, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess if I understand it correctly, part of the motivation of sharing them is there is data that suggests that women today don't feel as empowered when it comes to exploring. What you're trying to do is to help women to become more adventurous, step out of their comfort zones by looking back on the expeditions of women who've come before them.
Yeah, and I think it's just about showing that women have always been there and actually that they still are there today. And we kind of need women to be visible in this space so that they feel like they can be a part of it. So that's a big part of the project as well, is just and showing that adventure can be anything. I think the problem today is on the TV and on social media as well. Adventure is seen in this kind of very macho way, and it's only men on the telly that are kind of adventurers. So it's about opening up and just saying, women have been in this space, that they did amazing things, but also you can do anything in the outdoors. It doesn't have to be, walking up the Himalaya with a chair on your back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a good segue because, I mean, I don't know that we'll cover all of your different adventures during the course of this podcast, but taking it to something that I guess, a lot of British skiers and snowboarders would relate to, you also followed the path of Nan Sheperd in the Cairngorms.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. So Nan is this incredible woman who walks around the Cairngorms. She wrote a book called The Living Mountain, which is now very famous. But when she wrote it at the time, no one would publish it. So it was just chucked in a drawer for 30 years. And then it was only much later in her life, I think in her 70s, when it eventually got published. But yeah, now it's celebrated as one of the best books ever written on British landscape and nature. And it's just this beautiful book. It's kind of like a philosophical text all about mountains and how it's not about getting to the top and conquering the mountain. It's about experiencing the mountain as a whole and its ecosystem. So yeah, I went to the Cairngorms and followed the book for a month, just wandering around in old tweed, just on my own.
So the theme of wearing and using the same equipment as in this case Nan Sheperd would have done. And remind me when she had her experience?
That was the 1940s.
Right. In fact, I might have read somewhere that she was using like war rations or something like that to.
Yeah, well, it was wartime. So she kind of escaped the mountains it was kind of her solace where she could find a bit of peace. So, and that's where the book kind of comes from.
And so that involved climbing, I think, the 6 highest peaks in the Cairngorms. But you stayed on after that and just kind of hung around.
Yeah, I just wanted
for a couple of weeks afterwards, right?
I just kind of floated around and just sort of, Nan has this thing is about learning to be in the mountains and just being at peace with yourself and almost going on this pilgrimage where, you kind of find peace. And that was the first time that, because I didn't have any modern stuff as well. I don't have any distractions. So I was completely in the moment. I would get up when the sun came up, go to sleep when the sun went down. I really became in tune with nature. And it was just this wonderful experience that I learned so much from. And I take a bit of that peacefulness with me kind of everywhere I go when things get a bit manic. I just think about that. But yeah, it was really incredible trip. Really amazing.
That's great. So you were wild camping, which I think Scotland's one of the few places where technically that's allowed. But what were you staying in then? Do you have a tent with you?
Yeah, so I had a 1940s like wartime tent. And I will say it's harder to just pitch your tent anywhere in Scotland than I first thought. It's actually especially in the Cairngorms, the floor is like super rough. It's got all that foliage and spiky plants. So that was a bit of a challenge. But yeah, I was basically in this old tent that also doubled up as a vaguely waterproof poncho. So you can imagine what people thought when I walked past them.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm thinking maybe in terms of food, you were, using dehydrated meals or something.
Well, I try and stick really to what they had at the time, just as it's another part of it to really get the experience. So I just kind of looked at what they would have had when it was wartime, and there was lots of surprising things. Like there was things like a little bit of chocolate they would have had sometimes, which maybe like all the Mars bars I took weren't quite right, but I took a few bits like that. But yeah, I think I just try and keep everything as similar, because I would never understand like fully what they went through if I, was either snacking on energy bars or drinking energy drinks, or if I had big fluffy down jacket. I would never really fully understand what they went through and what their writing was really about. So that's why I do it in the old stuff.
Yeah, and a lot of people have enjoyed going to Scotland or often think about going to Scotland. One of the limiters, perhaps, and certainly in my experience, if listeners will recall my trip to Scotland last year, the weather can be unpredictable. You don't always get what you would like, or if you do, you maybe just have to wait another hour or so before it starts being raining and a howling gale again. What was it like for you while you were up there then?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly had a lesson there, because it was sort of June, July time. I thought it'd be bright sunshine, lovely, but no, it was sideways rain for 2 weeks. So actually a lot of it I kind of spent huddling under rocks and trying to sort of gather myself. But yeah, the last 2 weeks was amazing. The sun eventually came out, but it's just a part of it, experiencing all those different weathers. But yeah, I was very naively thought it would be lovely up there in the summer.
What a great experience. And, I've done wild camping a bit in England, don't tell anyone. And, I love that when you get up in the morning and there's no one else around and you're the
Oh, I
first
love it.
to see the world. Normally I'm walking along like maybe the South Downs Way or the coastal path somewhere. It's such a great experience. Another one I wanted to ask you about was Ben Nevis. I think that was Jane Inglis-Clarke or Jane Clarke. What particularly motivated you to want to do that particular ascent?
Well, I really love doing UK ones because there's all these women from the UK that are just really unheard of. And I always say they should be on our stamps. Like, they're just so incredibly impressive what they did. So Jane, she did a lot of the first tricky climbing routes in Scotland, and she founded the Scottish Women's Climbing Club in 1908 just because she wasn't allowed in the men's one. So she just thought, oh, well, I'll just make my own. And it's still going today. And it's just that mindset that I love. So yeah, I went up Ben Nevis with what she would have had in the early 1900s, just to kind of celebrate her and honour her, I suppose, and tell her story. But yeah, she's brilliant, really, really amazing woman.
Well, in some respects, that was possibly a warm-up because, Ben Nevis, something I have been up, maybe quite a few people have been up, although not in, early 20th century equipment and clothing. But in 2024, I guess that was last summer, wasn't it? You went to Chamonix to replicate the climb of Mont Blanc.
Yeah, so we went in September. So this was the first woman to climb Mont Blanc unaided in 1838. I say unaided because another woman had actually tried 30 years earlier, but she was carried to the summit because she got quite altitude sick. So this woman, Henriette d'Angeville, she went in 1838 and wanted to become the first woman to do it, like off her own back, basically. And she wore this incredible outfit that she made herself because there was no outdoor clothing for women back then. So she had to think, how do I make this outfit where I can actually climb and walk, but I'm also warm? So it was quite the ensemble. And if anyone's been to Chamonix, she's actually on the mural in the town centre, which a lot of people I spoke to there didn't know who she was on there. So I kind of created this outfit and went to Chamonix and tried to climb Mont Blanc. And I wanted to summit on the same day she did, so the 4th of September, which obviously comes with a lot of problems with the weather, which we faced while we were there. So yeah, it was quite a trip.
Okay, so a lot of questions coming to mind just then. So firstly, you said she's on the mural, and I know the mural that you're talking about. How did you know it was her who was on there?
I just saw her. I was just in the town. I was like, hang on a minute. There she is. She's up there, like right at the top in the corner in her amazing outfit. So yeah, she's just kind of there.
Right. And then next question, the amazing outfit that she created for herself, which you recreated. How did you do that? What was it? Can you describe, the outfit that she had?
Yeah, I mean, she had this massive bonnet, and it was all, so women were not allowed to wear trousers in 1838 in Europe. Like, if you went out in them, you'd get shouted at, you'd get abuse thrown at. Like, it was awful. So but she needed trousers because she didn't want to climb in just a dress, because obviously it would just blow up. So she ended up wearing these really heavy, like woolen trousers under this huge wool dress, and it was made of Scottish tweed. So I ended up sort of finding a similar pattern, because obviously all the pictures are black and there's no photos, actually, it's all drawings of her. So they're all in black and white. So I had to kind of think what colours they would have had back in the day. And I found this amazing piece of fabric that was made on the Scottish borders. And I just got my mum to help me sew it up. So we made this massive dress, got a bonnet made actually by this woman who just reached out to me. This is the thing about the project. All these people get involved who are so kind and wonderful. And this woman, Sophie, had actually made all the hats in the new Wicked film. And I had no idea until I sort of looked her up, but she made this incredible bonnet for me. And then I had these hobnail boots that I got from Trickers, which are like the oldest shoe company in the UK. They've got an amazing history, and actually made some of the first boots for some of the big male explorers back in the day. So I just kind of cobbled together this incredible outfit, and off I went.
So you said you had the hobnail boots made for you. That surely isn't a straightforward exercise. No one produces hobnail boots anymore, right?
No, so it's just about looking at what the boots were made of, always leather. And then, I got Adele, who's actually like the head shoemaker at Trickers, to craft these shoes for me. And they're absolutely, I mean, she makes the shoes for the king. So they're these incredible shoes from her. And then she actually knew all about hobnail boots. So she then found the hobnails, which are literally just nails hammered into the sole. And then they're kind of for grip. So they're kind of rough on the bottom. So that's how we made them. But that's it. You have to kind of piece it together, because there's not really any shoes from 1838 still around that I could borrow. So I had to make them myself.
Sure. I mean, I can see that, compared with some of the other challenges you've done, this is, recreating something from an earlier period. You mentioned before, if you wanted to try and replicate the original backpack that had been used by, just tracking back, Alexandra David-Neel, it cost you several £1,000s. Did you have to kind of buy these hobnail boots yourself?
No, well, this is the thing. These company just sort of reached out and offered to help, which is the amazing thing about this project. And I've created this community that's just so wonderful, and everyone's so helpful. They just offered to help, and then in return, I guess they kind of get to be involved in the project and get all the pictures and things like that, and get to tell the story as well. So that's kind of how it works. But yeah, I was just very lucky. I mean, they were founded in 1830 something, this shoe company. So they've been around when Henriette was doing her climb, which is really crazy, and it's a lovely link.
Yeah, well, I'll put a link to them in the show notes. That might only help them marginally, but help them as well. And in terms of other equipment, how do you source these things? I guess you're recreating everything, because thinking about when I was in Courmayeur earlier this year, there was a fantastic museum devoted to, I think it's Joseph Heilbronner, who Quant Heilbronner is named after him, and they've got a fantastic museum with lots of original equipment in there. And I'm thinking it must be really, really difficult to create that stuff.
Yeah, it depends what it is and the time. I find anything after 1930 is quite easy to source. Well, not easy, but there's a lot of that stuff still circulating. But anything before that, it's you kind of have to get it made. I know that we've, in the Inghams office, actually, we've got all these old skis from really old, and they're amazing, that kind of thing. But yeah, often I kind of write to museums and ask if I can borrow things, and they always say no. But if I can't source something, then I'll just look at the material, look at what it was made of, and then get someone to help me recreate it, basically. So it's a little bit of shopping around and then making my own stuff.
And another adventure which you've been on recently was to Corsica, one of my favourite places. I went there last summer and been there several times, done the JR Van, which I thought was quite impressive, but not quite as impressive as your own adventure there. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we went to celebrate Dorothy Pilley, who again is this prolific, incredible climber from the early 1900s. So she went to Corsica in 1922, and she was from the UK, and she did all these incredible things for women in climbing. She founded the Pinnacle Club, which is a climbing club for women still going today in the UK, which helps get women and girls from all different backgrounds into the mountains. I mean, her legacy still lives on. It's incredible. And she went to Corsica, one of the first places she went outside of the UK in the 1920s, and climbed all the different peaks there. So we went and climbed Monte Cinto, which is the highest peak there, which was a lot more challenging than I thought it would be because of the snow. There's a lot of snow to wade through, and yeah, it was hard. And I was head to toe in old woollen knickerbockers and the hobnail boots again. So yeah, it was a tough trip actually, but I've never been to Corsica and I'd love to go back. It was an amazing place.
Yeah, well, on my list is, I think it would be a great article and feature would be skiing in Corsica, and there is a resort there, but I'm interested to know how much snow there was there because you were there last month,
A
weren't
lot.
you, in February?
They do a lot of ski touring there actually. So one of the mountain guides we had there also does the ski touring. They said it's quite a small window, kind of February time. But yeah, there was a lot of snow when we were there.
Do you know what altitude the snow line went down to when you were there just now?
Oh no, I don't. I couldn't tell you that.
What altitude is Monte Cinto?
I think it's 2,600 meters. And there was quite a lot of snow right up to the top. Yeah, it's an incredible place with those snowy peaks, and then you can see the sea. Amazing. So we walked, we kind of recreated the way she went. We got the train from Bastia down to Visivona, which is where you kind of start doing all the hiking from. So then we just hiked from there. But yeah, it was really, really wonderful place. I'd really recommend it.
Well, I would recommend it too. I'm a huge fan of Corsica. I wonder if I can ask you a question about something that's not really about, well, your women with altitude challenges, but certainly another challenge that possibly more people might be familiar with, which is the TV program Alone on Channel 4. I think the one I'm thinking of was probably broadcast, I'm guessing in 2023, but I'm not 100%
it's like
sure
a year and a
about
half
that.
ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to just explain to the listeners what the concept is of this program?
Yes, so you're basically dropped in the middle of the wilderness and you have to survive. And basically whoever survives the longest wins a hefty amount of money.
You were one of how many contestants?
There was 11 of us.
Yeah, and where were you dropped?
So it's northern Canada, which is the reason I did it, was just this chance to be in one of the last great wildernesses of Earth, like on my own. It's such an amazing opportunity to try and live off the land, which is something I'd always wanted to do. So I agreed to do it, and yeah, it was absolutely wild, totally wild.
Yeah, well, you say you wanted to do it, but I imagine the selection process was pretty difficult. Even though it sounds like a crazy type of thing, they must be oversubscribed for these type of programs.
Well, interestingly, I only had 3 weeks to prepare because they'd really struggled to get women. So they did this huge hunt basically 2 months before because they were like, we need to get more women. So they found me on Instagram and it all happened really quickly. I didn't need to go through any selection process. I just did a couple of interviews. And then when I found out what the show was about, I was like, yeah, this sounds great. I'd love to do it. So it was all quite simple for me. But then all of a sudden I was kind of flying out to Canada and I was trying to like fatten myself up, like eat everything I could because that's what everyone, but some of them had been known they were going to be on it for about 3 to 6 months. So they were sort of way ahead of me in terms of mentally preparing themselves. But yeah, so it was all a bit of a whirlwind.
And just to clarify then, listeners, so you're being dropped off in northern Canada. What do they leave you with in terms of provisions and or equipment?
Yeah, so it's all filmed by us, so totally alone, hence the name. So we did 2 weeks of camera training before so that we knew how to use it all. And then you can take 10 items with you off this pre-approved list, but they do it in a certain way where you can only choose one thing or two things from each section. So you're always going to sacrifice something. So you basically need to decide, am I going to catch fish or am I going to hunt with a bow and arrow, like that sort of thing. So you have to select all them. And then, yeah, they basically drop you and you have like an emergency walkie-talkie thing. If anything, like a bear does attack you, but they're 40 minutes away. So you are on your own essentially. And then if you use the emergency thing, you're kind of out. So you have to be very careful about what you do with it. I mean, it was, a really incredible experience.
Did they leave you with matches?
No. So one thing on the list was ferro rod. It's one of the, you strike it and it makes a spark. So you have to know how to
Right.
make a fire. And I actually didn't really know a lot of this stuff. I was told everyone was in the same boat as me. And then I got there and it turns out like one of them runs a survival company. One of them worked for Bear Grylls. I was like, oh God, I've made a huge mistake. So I actually hadn't been successful in making a fire before I was dropped because I just hadn't had time. But one really good tip is birch bark is really flammable. And luckily where I was dropped was loads and loads of birch. So that was great. So I just kind of used that and it little spark and it just goes up.
Your priority was making a shelter as soon as you were dropped?
Yeah, they say you should do that while you've still got all the energy. So make a shelter and try and catch some sort of fish or something while you're doing that. So yeah, it was just about building a shelter. I'd learned my shelter off YouTube the week before. It was just, but actually it turned out pretty good and it was really cozy and I spent a long time in there. Like it was great.
Well,
And
I guess this was evidently after you've been in the Cairngorms and some of your other adventures. So, you had some
yeah,
pretty good prep for this
exactly.
sort of thing. And what about food then? What did you eat and how difficult did you find it to find enough food?
Yeah, so at the beginning there was quite a lot of berries and things like that you could eat, but then they quickly went they drop you at a time where the weather, October, it's kind of nice, and then it very quickly gets cold, so that they kind of get you in that bit of. So then it was fishing for me because I wasn't confident in any other sort of hunting. I'd never done it before, so I just tried to catch the fish. But again, I think my lack of fishing knowledge was my demise in the end. But I caught a few, so.
You say was your demise in the end, but if I recall correctly, well, firstly, just tell me how long you were out there for.
34 days, I think I did in the end. But I honestly, they edited it in such a dramatic way, but I actually had the most beautiful, immersive, wonderful time. I was just hungry a lot. But if I had food, it would have been like the happiest time of my life out there. It was great. And then the last few days, I hadn't had enough food, so I really sort of went downwards.
I think, my behavior starts to get erratic if I haven't eaten for a couple of happening for a couple of hours.
That's the thing, we're
But
so used to food just being there. It's like
I
there
know,
in
I
packets
know.
in the soup. We can have it whenever we want. And that was the thing, is like when that's taken from you, you just it's really interesting kind of thing that your brain goes through as well. Like, yeah, it's
Yeah,
crazy.
well, it must have been fascinating. And yeah, you've got those 34 days, you've got no contact with other people. You don't know what's going on. And what you didn't know, I guess, before you picked up that walkie-talkie to contact the guys saying, look, I think it's time to end this, is that, in fact, there are only two of you left who were still out
Yeah.
there at that point.
I thought I was going to come last. I thought they were going to be out there for months, the way they were all wheeling their axes around in the training. I thought, honestly. And I was so shocked. Yeah, so shocked. But Tom, who won, he's so skilled at what he does. And he was catching 4 or 5 fish a day. He had them stored for winter. They didn't actually show that. They made it look like we were really close, but we weren't. So I would never have been able to stay as long as he did anyway. So I'm still pretty glad I tapped out when I did.
I still
No
think
idea.
it's an incredible achievement for sure. And, I don't know if it's still available, but I'll put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, you can still watch it.
There are a lot of challenges to come. I think what's coming next is that you're going back to Chamonix to climb Mont Blanc, because one of the things, I think you alluded to it when we were talking about it before, but the weather didn't really play ball. You wanted to summit on the anniversary or on the same day that she climbed the mountain, summited the mountain, but the weather intervened on that occasion. So you're going to be going back there again, later this year?
Yes, we're going in June, going to try again. And we're actually going to, if the weather is nice to us this time, we're going to try and do the original route she did. So walking from the centre of Chamonix and then all the way up the original route that they used to do. And now people go around the back and the other way as the really commercial route. But yeah, we're going to try for the original route. And if not, we'll have to do the normal one. But apparently it's maybe possible in June to do that. So, and if not, we'll just try again. And I was questioning why I was doing it again because I raised her story and shared it and it was great. And, I had a lot of press from it and stuff, but we didn't really get that far up. We got to the first hut before we had to turn around, and I have everything ready to go. So I thought, well, let's just give it one more go.
I guess the advantages this time around are that, you've got all of the equipment already. You don't have to go through sourcing all of that. But also these different adventures and challenges that you've done, funding them is an issue. And I think this time you've also got funding as well.
Oh, funding's the worst. It's the bit I just hate. It's so demoralizing, and you get no's all the time. But yeah, amazingly, Hotelplan, who actually own Inghams, just offered to fund this trip and also the film that we're going to finally make from it all. So yeah, really excited, and it's just a wonderful feeling because I can just kind of relax a bit and just get on with planning the film, and I don't have to think about the funding side of things. So yeah, very lucky that they've offered that.
Other than preparing yourself to climb Western Europe's highest mountain using hobnail boots and a tartan or a tweed kind of coat.
Well, I always say that's the easy bit. After the funding's the hard bit. I'm happy to climb any mountain because once you're up there, you've actually done the hard bit. So that's just the next bit.
And you mentioned as well who's we in this context for the Mont Blanc challenge?
Yeah, I always say we because I did the Nan Sheperd trip on my own, but I always try and employ women like in this space. So mountain guides, for example, I'm sure lots of people in the ski world know this, but there's a huge lack of women mountain guides. So Karen Bockel, who's my guide for Mont Blanc, she's actually the most experienced mountain guide I've ever had. She's really knowledgeable, and she actually teaches at the famous guiding school in Chamonix. So she teaches the next generation of mountain guides, and she was saying about 2% of them are women still today. So out of the 45 that graduated last year, 1 or 2 were women. So there's still this huge issue with it. So I just want to make sure that the project is supporting women in the adventure space. And then there's also Grace, who films my trips. So again, in adventure filmmaking, I mean, you go to Kendal Mountain Festival, it's pretty much all guys. So again, it's about supporting women in the filmmaking space as well. So I'm always with a little group of badass women. I love that part of it.
Excellent. I look forward to following that in June of 2025. You've already got some amazing imagery from the first trip. And I think all of these things, if your goal is to help women feel more empowered when it comes to exploring and how women can be, more adventurous, I think you're achieving all of that.
Oh, thank you.
It's one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you, and I think just the timing that our conversation comes shortly after International Women's Day. But this is part of a series of podcasts about women within the snow sports industry who are inspiring others. So thank you for that and for your work, and thanks for sharing your time today. And best of luck for Chamonix later on this year.
Thanks so much.
Well, I hope you found that as interesting as I did. I enjoy all feedback about the show. I'm always interested to hear what you think. So if you enjoyed this episode, please do let me know on social at The Ski Podcast or by email theskipodcast@gmail.com. We've had a couple of items of feedback since the last podcast. Emma Budget on Spotify said, "Fantastic podcast. My husband and I have been listening religiously since before COVID. Now that we're taking our first holidays as a young family, it's been so useful picking up tips and tricks from your episodes about skiing with kids. It's unbelievably rewarding skiing the slopes with them for the first time. Thanks to the podcast. We love it." And Emma, I agree with you. I love my family holidays. They're so important to me. Ian Simpson said, "Great podcast. Gives me so many travelling ideas, especially by train. Any chance you could do one exploring by motorhome? Small community type resorts working together for the van people who like exploring the mountains in Europe. We did actually do an episode about van life before. I'll put a link into the show notes. So listeners, you can listen to that if you'd like to. There are now 253 episodes of the Ski Podcast to catch up with, and 166 of those were listened to in the last week. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not go to skipodcast.com and take a look around the tags and categories? You're bound to find something of interest to you there. Now, in that last week, around 2/3 of our listeners were in the UK, 15% in the States, and everyone else spread as far and wide as Egypt, South Korea, and Venezuela. If you like the podcast, there are 3 things you can do to help. Follow us. Just look for that button and press it now. Give us a review or leave a comment on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or book your ski hire with InSport Rent using the code SKIPODCAST, or simply take the link in the show notes. You can follow me at Skipedia and the podcast at the Ski Podcast. You can also follow us on WhatsApp for exclusive material released ahead of each podcast. I'll be back next week with episode 242, when we'll be discussing Selva Val Gardena in Italy, Mürren in Switzerland, and Saint-Gervais in France. Until then, I'd like to thank Elise for giving up her time to join me. And finally, listener, thank you for joining us, wherever in the world you're listening right now. And until next time, goodbye.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.